You're listening to Olivia's Book Club, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.
Hey everybody, and welcome to Olivia's Book Club, and I'm still your host, Olivia Fierro. Thanks for checking in with us to talk about books. My guest today is the author of In the Mouth of the Wolf, A Murder, a Cover-Up, and the True Cost of Silencing the Press. Katherine Corcoran is an experienced, very interesting journalist who previously served as the Associated Press bureau chief based in Mexico City. She was covering Mexico and Central America, and the book is a product of her time there and a story that really affected her personally, and she wanted to investigate. It really shines a light on the dangers that journalists in Mexico face when they're exposing crime and trying to bring truth to power, and obviously it is a dangerous profession now more than ever, and not just exclusively in Mexico. So Katherine, congratulations on this book. It just came out in October, and obviously it's a personal story. I mean, not your personal story, but something that you're personally connected to as a journalist, because to see this happen to a journalist and many others across Mexico, I mean, the climate's so dangerous.
It is. First of all, thank you for having me, and thank you for your interest in the book. It is dangerous. It continues to be very dangerous, especially for journalists who want to investigate corruption. And it was one of the reasons I wrote the book, because the problem started probably around 2006, 2007. And at the time, I thought the numbers were shocking. It was 6, 7 a year. This year there's 13. Wow. And so I just thought, nothing's being done about it. Maybe I could just bring this story to a wider audience and maybe see something more interest or more support for these journalists. And
we know that organizations that are tracking violence against journalists around the globe are really calling this an epidemic right now. Yes. And there are no countries, especially democracies, that have that number of journalist killings, not even close, unless a country is at war. I think this year only Ukraine surpasses Mexico in the number of journalists who are killed. And another reason for writing the book, I just didn't understand. I didn't understand why was a democracy so dangerous for journalists. And we fundamentally know the value of the role of the journalist in democracy, right? To be exposing when the people are not being served appropriately and what's going on behind the scenes. And obviously, I guess the complexity of Mexican government is that you've got the cartels as a powerful force, you've got the government, and oftentimes there is so much of looking the other way or working together, not in the interest of public service, right?
Exactly, and that's really what it is. Mexico transitioned from authoritarian one-party rule to a democracy in the 90s. It was a long developing process, but finally they had a democratically elected president in 2000. And a lot of the journalists that I talked to, the more modern journalists, that's why they're doing this. They believe that it's important to a democracy to have a free press. The problem is that for many decades before, under authoritarian rule, the press was controlled by the government. And so there isn't really a tradition or a value like there is in our country from its foundation. That was important. The free press was important. And so they're developing that part of the democracy. And so it's very difficult for these reporters who want to be the watchdogs and speak truth to power to be in this system where, on the one hand, the government is not used to that. And on the other hand, the public isn't used to it either. The public never really did trust journalists because they knew they were co-opted by the government. And so while they're investigating and speaking truth to power, there also has to be a process for the society to understand what journalists do and why it's important. And that's still developing in Mexico as well. And so that's why these journalists work under such difficult conditions and without a lot of support but they do have the ideal of this. We have to do this. This is important to develop our democracy.
So interesting the way you lay that out, because so in essence they also have to sort of re-educate the public about, okay, we're not an arm of the government. This is not a propaganda machine. We are reporting what we find out to be factual and important to your community or to our lives or criminal justice or what have you. And in other parts of the world, we're seeing sort of a shift where we're reversing that, right? Where we're having an emerging distrust of the media over the last several years that maybe had never been experienced before.
That's a really important point, and what I really try to get across in my talks is that while we're actually heading in the direction of Mexico, while Mexico is trying to be more like us and more traditionally a country of free press, or that supports the free press, and so we're pretty much all in the same situation around the world right now, as in terms of the free press.
It makes you realize that the journalists of Mexico who are native to the country, who you have been working with as colleagues, and of course we're talking to closely in the researching and writing of this book, have got to be really incredible and impressive people given this circumstance. I mean, you're more of a trailblazer. You're inherently taking on something that is new and almost revolutionary and filled with a lot of uncertainty.
Exactly. A lot of the reporters that I interviewed, they said they wanted to do this because it was important for the country and important for the free press. And I said, but where did you get that notion? Because you didn't grow up with it. Because growing up, the press was controlled. And they said, basically, they learned it in the university in classes about democracy, and decided that was something that really needed to be part of the transition in Mexico. But unfortunately, because it has become so dangerous, it does run a lot of good people out of the profession. And it's also difficult to attract good people because a lot of parents don't want their children to go to school and study journalism. They're concerned for their safety.
Sure, and that's understandable. Before we dig into the book and the focus of the particular murder that you were focusing on here, tell me a little bit about what your career was like there when you were based in Mexico City, and how you kind of how you landed there, and kind of where you came from, and what were some of the particulars that were maybe most challenging or most exciting about reporting in a foreign country?
Well, I'm not from the Western United States. I'm from the Midwest, but I started my journalism career in Arizona, and then later went to Colorado and California, all states with big Mexican populations, migrant populations, but also Mexican American. And so I learned early on that I really needed to speak Spanish to cover the community, because as you know, we learned that you have to cover all the community. And if you don't have certain language skills, it limits your access. And so I started on that path. And then when I got to California, I started covering Mexico from California for the San Jose Mercury News. And I would take trips down to Mexico. And really from my very first trip, I decided I have to work here. It's a fascinating country, and it's a country that most Americans don't know outside of border towns or resorts. But once you get into the interior of the country, it's beautiful. The culture is very rich and very diverse. Every region has its own culture, its own food, its own history. And I just became fascinated. It really is a beautiful country. And so after that, I worked to try to find a position where I could be there full time. And when I got there, that was when things were getting bad for journalists. When I covered Mexico from California, I would go there by myself, and I'd get a taxi driver and a map, and I could go pretty much anywhere, and didn't worry about my safety at all. At that time, people worried about their safety in Mexico City. Everyone warned me that Mexico City was really dangerous, but it's dangerous like any big city. But going out in the pueblos, in the states, you didn't worry about anything. And that changed very dramatically, and it changed right when I got there. So all of the journalists had to rethink how we were covering the country, because we were used to having a lot of freedom, and we had to start thinking about our security and the safest way to cover stories.
Did you have moments along the way where you said, well, maybe this is not where I want to be anymore because you felt unsafe, because you were weighing the benefits of the work you were doing to the potential risk to yourself?
Yes, we definitely had to do that. And as bureau chief, I had to do that for every
others,
journalist.
yeah.
And we had to consider the risk on every story. We tried not to let that limit what we covered, but sometimes it limited how we covered it. We would want to go out in the field to get a particular story, and we had our collaborators, stringers on the ground, and they would say, it's not really safe to come out right now. And so we would have to do it from a distance, or we'd have, and a lot of times it wasn't safe for them to cover a certain story, even though they were on the ground and local. And so we had to weigh that as well, because we used our system of stringers, or we'd have to do it long distance, or sometimes we would send a photographer and the photographer would do the reporting, those kinds of things. But we tried very much never to let it limit what we covered, just how we covered it.
Tell me about the murder of Regina Martinez, and what about this hit you in such a way that you would focus on a book and make it a professional focus for you?
Well, I remember very clearly the moment that I read she had been murdered, and it caught my attention because I had actually spoken to her 6 months before. Again, for this kind of situation, there was a big breaking news, basically a mass killing by the cartels in Veracruz where she worked. And we were having trouble getting someone out there, and I was looking for someone local to cover the story. And she previously had been an AP stringer, and so one of our editors said, hey, why don't you try her? I think she might be working for another organization now, but it's worth a try. So I called her, and she answered the phone, and we had a very brief chat. And she was working for Proceso, the magazine where she was working when she was murdered, and she was covering the story for Proceso. So it turned out that she didn't really have time to help us out, but she tried. It's interesting because, when you ask a reporter to do a story, they never want to say no if it's a real reporter. And she kind of hemmed and hawed, like, oh, I wish I could. But then she said, give me a couple hours and call me back. And when I called her back, she said, no, it's just not going to be possible. And it was just a very brief encounter that I forgot about until I read her name. And I couldn't believe it, because up to that time, there were a lot of killings, and the government was telling us that they were all crime reporters who were working for the cartels, that they were corrupt journalists, they were being paid by the cartels. And we had no way of knowing because there were no investigations. And certainly that phenomenon existed, and it still exists, but the numbers were so high, you couldn't say that all of them were that. And then when she was murdered, it was just so obvious that, what was going on. It was a way to really look at what was really going on, because she didn't fit that profile at all. She didn't cover crime. She was very well known as being a tenacious reporter of standards and ethics, producing really good journalism. So it not only was it that brief personal connection, but it was a clear way to look at, why is this so out of control? Why are they going after all these journalists?
Not only why is it happening, but then why is the system working so hard to cover it up and to wash it away and to keep us from, to really also taint the reputations of those who have been murdered, erode any good work that they had done as a professional journalist, and then make it kind of just go away because now it's a victim that's not really a true victim, right?
Exactly. And that was the strategy. And as you see in the book, they did that with her too. They couldn't paint her as corrupt. They knew that no one would believe that, and so they created a double life where she was dating a street criminal, and so as you know, with women, if they can't get you on one thing, then you're going to be loose, or you were out carousing and it was your fault. So they had to find a way to make it look like it was her fault.
So as you are researching this, investigating this, and looking for answers, you're connecting with the women who had worked with her, who admired her work, who looked up to her. Everybody, of course, gutted by the loss, and also furious that nobody's being brought to justice for this heinous crime. So as you're approaching this book, what happens next?
So I had the good fortune of getting to know one of her closest friends in another arena. He came to the AP looking for work as a stringer in Veracruz, and I needed a stringer there, and he came highly recommended from a fellow journalist. And so I hired him, and just as an afterthought, because I knew he was from Veracruz, and this case was just living in the back of my head. I didn't really have time to do anything with it, but I said, "Do you know anything about the Regina Martinez case?" And it turned out, he said, she was my good friend. And we proceeded to work together and get to know each other, and had a lot of respect for each other as journalists. And so when I finally had the time to dig into this, I asked him if he would help me. And actually, initially when we met, he seemed very eager, even then, for me to do something, because nobody there could write about it. It was too dangerous. And they were very eager for the story to get out and to find someone who could tell the story. And so I think, if anything, he would have wanted me to do it right away, but I didn't have the time. So then when I did have the time, I went back to him and I said, "This is what I want to do. What do you think?" And he said, "Well, let me talk to her other friends." And they said yes. And I think without that connection, I definitely could not have written the book as I did, and maybe not at all, because it was so difficult to get inside and to get people to talk about the case.
For good reason. And then you find yourself kind of in the same situation as when you're being a bureau chief, where you're trying to kind of protect people. The job needs to be done, the story needs to be told, and you know how important it is, and that's what she would want, I mean, certainly. But also at the same time, your concerns for those who are participating and cooperating with you had to be just through the roof.
Yes, I would say that was the most difficult part of the work, because people always asked me if I felt threatened, or about how, did anything happen to me? And really it didn't at all, because I followed a security protocol, and I, had my precautions, but I really stayed under the radar as much as possible, and never had any indication that people knew I was there. Well, there was one that I write about in the book, but I was very concerned about the people who were talking to me, because it was dangerous for them to talk to me. And so that's what preoccupied me the most, where I would go to fellow journalists for advice. How do I do this? And that was definitely the most difficult part of the book.
So as you are digging into the circumstances surrounding her murder and the cover-up and just the layers and the layers, what was the kind of gamut of emotions that you went through? I mean, and it's an interesting role for you to be in, because, we think about certainly investigative journalism allows you to dig in for a longer period of time and be more invested in the storytelling. But as journalists, we're, trying to report these things and not be part of a story. But how can you not become a part of a story when you're learning so much about a respected peer from the people who, miss her and know, how wrong what has gone on truly is. I mean, the emotional investment has got to just grow and grow.
It does, and that's another difficult part, because I spent so much time with these people, and they became my friends, and they trusted me. And so I didn't want to betray that trust in any way by putting them in harm's way. And I mean, they're journalists, so they knew what they were doing, but still, and I'm still in touch with them, and I still check in to see how they're doing. And so it's a little different kind of reporting than what we normally do on stories. But you still can't cross any lines. You still have to have your boundaries. And one of the things I do is I always make it very clear to people why I'm there and what I'm doing, so that they can make their own decisions about whether it's something that they want to participate in or not. And so that was a big concern, or making sure that people understood what the potential consequences were. And they did. I mean, it was, everyone there lived in fear. But the other thing was just the difficulty of it. Sometimes I would say, okay, well, today I need to go out and I need to find this person. And some days I would just say, I'm not going to do that today. Or I remember one of the writers that I admire most, Joan Didion. I remember reading her. She said that some days she would sit all day and stare at the phone because she was so afraid to make a phone call. And that made me feel better, because you always think that journalists are just out there,
fearless, right?
And there were a lot of times when I think probably, I remember one point when I had to go to the neighborhood where she lived and where the murder occurred. That was probably the most difficult, because then I couldn't be under the radar.
Yeah.
I was clearly a stranger, American, out there walking around. And I was trying to think about, how can I do this so that I can get what I need and not just chase everybody indoors, because they're like, oh, we're not talking. And that did happen, as you see in the book. But so when I'm sitting in my hotel room and I have a plan, okay, I'm going to get up and I'm going to do this and this and this. And then I get up and I'm like, I don't know. I don't know if I have the right plan. I'll call somebody. What do you think of this idea? Do you think this will work? And so there were a lot of moments like that, just moments of doubt about, how do I really do this?
Were there moments that stood out to you where you forced yourself to move forward? Obviously you did, because we have the book. The book is not just an idea, it's out. Were there moments where you felt like, I've made huge progress with this? Like, this is like, mind blown emoji. Like, it's, I'm learning what I'm finding what I'm setting out to find.
Yes, I think, deadlines help. So I think when I actually sat down to write it, I realized that I had a lot more than I thought I did. You always, out on a story, you always feel like, I didn't get it, I don't have it, I have to go back, I have to get more. And I think when I sat down to write it, I realized what I had. But again, like, the doubt and the paralysis is part of I learned to embrace it. It's part of the process, because there were some days or nights, especially when you wake up, and even up to the very end, where I would think, I don't have it. I don't have a book to turn in. And then I would think, okay, well, what is that going to mean? And I would go into that spiral. And then the next day I'd wake up and I'd just get back at it. So it's like, it's just I learned that in those moments, you're actually processing, and you need that time to panic and rethink, because it helps the whole process. I didn't realize that till later on.
Until you could reflect back and go, okay, I did it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
How did you communicate what your goals were when you first started to investigate this?
Well, I had the idea, and I did a lot of work before I actually tried to find a publisher. And I did a lot of reporting, and I did a lot of, how can I make this a book that people will want to read? Because I knew that it would be a tough sell writing about journalists in Mexico. People don't really think or care that much about journalists in general, and then to make it about Mexico. And so I would say I spent at least a couple of years. I had a fellowship where I had to write for the fellowship, so I put a lot of the material together for that first. So that helped me start to formulate exactly how it could be a book. And then when I went to look for a publisher, of course, they say, well, how does this relate to the rest of the world? How does this relate to people in the United States who are going to be the main audience? And so you have to think about the book on many levels. As a journalist, you just want to tell the story. It's a good story, it's a meaningful story. And I wanted to show so many things about these journalist killings that just weren't getting reported. I wanted to show the impact on the people around them, on their families. I wanted to write about them as human beings, because the coverage, when you do have coverage, is mostly about, silencing the press, freedom of expression, et cetera, and that's about it. And the person's not really looked at as a human being with family and friends, and I found that was a huge. People are, to this day, are devastated by what happened, and they carry that around with them basically for the rest of their lives. And so I wanted to show just how damaging this was, not only obviously to the person who loses their life, but to the whole community around them, the trauma. And so there were so many things that I wanted to show that I hadn't read about myself in these cases. But then, of course, there were the other angles, like what does it mean? There's always there's the story, and then there's the what does it mean? Why should people read this story? And so then I had to develop that angle as well. And then when things started getting worse for journalists in the United States, which was something I didn't anticipate at all of a sudden it was very easy to understand why the book was important.
And I think it's interesting because, I guess, as a Mexican American, I just always my ears always perk up when you hear people talk about the perceptions of Mexico and perceptions of this and that. And there's always sort of an American arrogance, right? That things are better here, and certainly more just here and more civilized here, or whatever. And it is been shocking to see, how blurry everything has gotten, and how we have been. The importance really in the wonderful timing of your book coming out is that reminder of the fragility of the system and how important these voices are to tell the truth without fear. And the more fearful they need to become, and the more targeted and silenced and vilified that these journalists are, the weaker we all are as a society, and we're not immune to that vulnerability.
Absolutely. As I say in the book, the difficulty about reporting in Mexico is it's hard to find the truth. There's not a premium on telling the truth, because historically that could get you into a lot of trouble. When you're in a controlled system, you learn to say what people want you to say and not to tell the truth. And so, yes, the everything there is very blurry about what really happened. And the government participates so many times in these created narratives, montajes they call them, to cover up their problems and to say, well, let's just make this thing go away. It's part of the system. And so in that environment, it's very difficult to discern truth. Whereas I think after so many years as a reporter in the United States, I felt that was a fairly easy thing to do in most cases. And that's what's shocking about the change here, because truth has become sort of forgotten, or not forgotten, but there's a confusion and the disinformation, and there's an attempt, a concerted effort to make people doubt the truth. And that I had never seen in my own country. Whereas in a place like Mexico, that's how it is, but it's because of their history and their system and what people have to do to survive.
And I imagine as you, with teaching and also, writing as an expert regarding free press and kind of what we've seen go on in the last few years, and also, just historically taking a look at journalism and the importance of the role. I guess what gets lost in the translation maybe for a next generation is just what's truly at risk.
Absolutely. And that's what I wanted to show. That's really what I thought I could show with this story, is what good journalism does for society through her and the kind of work she did, and how she went against the grain. Even her colleagues weren't doing that kind of work, but she believed in it so much that she wanted to tell the truth. She wanted to find the truth and tell the truth. And then what happened after her murder, that all of that went away. Her murder was a very successful tactic in silencing the press. Her colleagues who were doing the kind of work she was doing felt they had to leave or were actually pulled out by their media organizations for their own safety. Mm-hmm. And the people who decided to stay self-censored, again, for their own safety. And so you see what happens in this criminal, as you mentioned, the combination of politicians and criminals and how they collude and what they do. And they're doing it with impunity. And there is no critical voice to let people know what was going on. Mm-hmm. And the people in this era under this government were living in fear, and they had no information. And so I wanted to show the good side, then what happens when it goes away. Mm-hmm. And then ultimately another factor in the story that I think was very helpful in the message I wanted to get across is that ultimately this criminal government in the state of Veracruz was taken down by journalists, mm-hmm. by investigative journalists. So after there was this void of reporting on anything except positive news about the governor, there was a team in Mexico City, again outside because the local journalists, it was too dangerous for them to do it, went in, reported on what they were doing, verified what they were doing, had documents, put everything on the internet. So it was a very transparent kind of investigation, and the house of cards fell down. And so I really wanted to show all that because I think a lot of people don't understand what journalists do, how we do it, why we do it, that we actually do have standards for publishing information, that we don't sneak around and pretend we're somebody else to fool people. I always tell people, if you did that for the Associated Press, you'd be fired. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to show all that because we know it inside our profession, but most people don't outside. And it's easy for them to say, oh, the press is bad, the press is biased, the press is this, the press is that. And sometimes they're right, but there are a lot of good things that the press does for a society, that important things that you don't want to lose. And that's really what I wanted to show in the book and lay it out in a place where our idea of free press is really changing and slipping, and we are starting to go down that road of attacks on the media and limiting access and all that kind of thing, and hopefully to start a conversation here to say, is that really the road we want to go mm-hmm. down?
And to always wonder, well, for those voices who are sharing that, don't trust them, they're lying, they're whatever, the why. What is it that they have to gain by the growing and sowing that distrust of the media? And it's inevitably power or money or, freedom to do whatever unchecked.
Right, for their own agenda.
Yes.
Basically they need to control you for their own agenda. Mm-hmm. That's what's going on. And the other thing I'd like to differentiate is there's always been criticism of the press. Mm-hmm. And we need criticism. That's how we improve. And the criticism in the past has been in the vein of do better. And a lot of times we can do better. But this criticism of the press is different. It's a shutdown. It's a controlling message. You don't need the press. Don't believe them. Believe me. Mm-hmm. And that was something that I had never heard before in my own country.
Yes, here in the United States. Yeah. Do you think, as you, and I'm sure that many journalists of different ages, and you've worked at universities and been part of programs where we're seeing the next generation, evolve. Do you think it's going to be very challenging for people, much like what you encountered in Mexico, as hard for young people to decide this is what I want to go into because of the scrutiny and because of the climate that we've been experiencing for the last few years?
Well, I guess the students I have already made that decision. Yeah. And I love working with students because we need new people. We need new ideas, fresh blood, fresh energy. And of course, they grew up in a different world than I did. And so in many ways, they have better tools than I do in understanding all the ways you can report. And so, and they're so eager and well prepared. That always surprises me because, again, you hear a lot of bashing of young people about how they don't want to work and et cetera, et cetera. And then I go into a classroom and I'm always pleasantly surprised at how well prepared and how eager they are. And so that gives me hope. That gives me hope. I worry about maybe the number of students who choose this profession, but also I worry about their opportunities because the press here is still very much in flux in terms of how do we finance good independent journalism, and there's every day more layoffs and thinning of staff, and that only hurts journalism. It makes it much harder to do good journalism when you don't put resources into it. So I'm hopeful for a change in that so that they can flourish. But I've taught students for at least 15 years and have kept in touch with them, and a lot of them are doing very well. So it gives me hope.
What is next for you? You've got your first book out now, and what do you move on to now?
Well, I still have projects in Mexico and some stories that I want to write there. I'm going to go on to another book. My next book will be domestic. It won't be about Mexico, but I very much keep my ties there. I'm involved in a program there that I'm really proud of. I created with a Mexican journalist, and we train editors in Mexico on how to lead investigations, because it's something where now the young reporters are coming out of school trained in how to do it, but they are really lacking in leadership because, again, there wasn't a tradition for doing that. And there's not a lot of, there's almost zero training for editors, much like it is here. And so we found this gap where we wanted to play a part. And so we have a 12-week program, virtual and then in person, on training Mexican editors in how to lead investigative projects. And it's so fun and it's so rewarding. So I'm going to continue with that.
Wow, that's fantastic. And I presume that the next book is also a work of nonfiction.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. That's my genre.
Well, I've been so surprised at how many novelists that I've interviewed here on this podcast that started out in journalism. So, whether it's just being able to, so they would say even just working on a deadline and being able to write quickly and put words on paper, and then, just some of the storytelling mechanisms that they had, learned to use on a quick turn for a newspaper, they were able to employ when they started to decide, okay, I want to write crime fiction or...
Yeah, and fiction takes a lot of research. I think people don't know that. In order to be good fiction, it takes a lot of research. I think fiction is harder to write than nonfiction, so I haven't thought about trying that.
So still on the to-do list later, maybe.
Right.
Well, what an absolute pleasure to speak to you. Would you mind giving me one little tidbit of a must-do? If Mexico City is maybe, so I assume, is Mexico City your favorite city in Mexico?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Well, actually, there are a lot, but it is a fabulous city.
Is there some other place that you think is often overlooked that you would encourage to be explored and enjoyed that is a favorite for you, whether it's for the food or the culture or the people or the
outside of
land?
Mexico City?
Sure.
Oaxaca is fabulous, and Guanajuato. Both, I think those are my, it's hard to say. There's so many beautiful cities, but I would say probably they're my two favorites. And then Mexico City, there are a lot of Americans visiting Mexico City now, and a friend of mine just published, I believe yesterday, in the New York Times, 36 Hours in Mexico City.
Oh, I love those articles.
I highly recommend looking at, because she has some fabulous recommendations. She's a fellow journalist down there, and she has places that I didn't know about. So I want to go. I want to follow her 36 Hours. So I would highly recommend looking that up.
Oh, absolutely, and we can try to link that here. That's fantastic. We went there. I went for the first time just last year. So yeah, it's a really remarkable city, and so thank you so very much. I noticed that on your book schedule you will be participating in the Festival of Books, right? in Tucson?
Yes.
Yeah, so in the
March.
spring. So that have you gone to this before? Because I've heard it's like the most fantastic thing.
No, I have not.
It's huge, apparently.
Oh, okay.
So I hope to see you there.
Well, I hope to see you there too. And thank you so much for your interest and your fabulous questions.
It was a pleasure.
So thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure for me.
Oh, wonderful. So Katherine Corcoran is the author of the book. It is In the Mouth of the Wolf, A Murder, a Cover-Up, and the True Cost of Silencing the Press. It is available now. Thank you so much for your time. Congratulations.
Thank you again.
Thanks for listening to Olivia's Book Club, the podcast. I'm your host, Olivia Fierro. Our producer is Margaret Stewart. You can send us an email with your thoughts or your book recommendations. Olivia's Book Club at azfamily.com is the address. And you can check out Olivia's Book Club on Facebook or find us on Instagram. Hello, Bookstagrammers, at olivias.bookclub. And Margaret is at Overbooked and Overdue. Make sure to rate and subscribe to this podcast and tell your friends. You can find us on Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and Amazon Music.
This is Olivia's Book Club, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.